What prompted the drafting of the white paper on the rights of persons with disabilities? Of what importance was the recent National Disability Rights Summit? Why are there still incidents of discrimination against persons with disabilities? Is enough being done to ensure full access to Braille and information for the visually impaired? What time is it? It is question time. Welcome to Question Time. My name is Mpho Tsedu. The white paper on the rights of persons with disabilities remains an integral part of the Disability Rights Charter adopted in 1992. Founded on the principles of the Freedom Charter, it works towards promoting and protecting the rights of persons with disabilities. In recognition of this piece of legislation, the National Disability Rights Summit was held in Irene South of Pretoria last week. The gathering reiterated the importance of the country's constitution that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, cognizant of the fact that persons with disabilities have equal rights and obligations as their fellow citizens. We are live. Therefore, you can call us. Air your views. The numbers to dial 089-110-4210. Twitter handle @QuestionTime24. My guest, Albert Peters, is a representative from the South African National Council for the Blind. And joining us from our Pretoria studio, Benny Padime is a director for advocacy and mainstreaming disability rights at the Department of Social Development. But before we get into the discussion, let's have a look at what the chairman of the SABC board had to say about the rights of people with disabilities.
Imagine government is saying people with disabilities in the government's workforce should constitute 2%, and we are far from reaching this quota, solely because, for instance, you will be asked whether you have a driver's license. Obviously, as a blind person, I can't drive. Is that not stigmatization? I believe it is. Sometimes you will even be told that, no, you are too costly for government to employ you.
That's the chairperson of the SABC board, Professor Magobe there. Let me welcome you, gentlemen, to the show. Benny, welcome also to Question Time today. Are you happy with the state of, let's firstly deal with awareness about the rights of people with disabilities?
Paul, look, the first thing I need to explain is that the question of disability rights awareness is a long-standing aspect of government's program. The very first awareness campaign that was quite sufficient, I suppose, was kicked off back in 1997. So that has gone on, and now government has now formalized it. Cabinet has now approved it as a month in a few years ago, around about 2013. Cabinet has approved this as a month, Disability Rights Awareness Month. Now, I must say to you, not quite, an opinion-building kind of process has been put into place, except the fact that there are campaigns that move towards now including disability aspects within all national coordinated days, commemorative days, celebrations, including the National Disability Rights Awareness Month that starts from the 3rd of November up to the 3rd of December. So it's basically how you practicalize it that actually will come to a point where we say we have a fully fledged disability rights awareness campaign. Article 7 and Article 8 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. 6, 7, and 8 talks to issues of women, children with disabilities, and also Article 8 speaks to the question of awareness raising. So each state party which has ratified that convention must adhere to that particular Article 8 in order to promote awareness in the society within the disability rights movement.
Okay. Mr. Peters, let me just come to you now. Obviously, we've just come out of the National Disability Rights Month, summit rather. Wouldn't it be better if a summit of this nature is all-inclusive?
Firstly, good evening to you, Paul. Good evening to my longtime friend and colleague, Benny Parime, and of course,
good evening,
to
sir.
the viewers.
Yes.
There are pros and cons of having such an event, annually or whatever the case might be. It just depends on the purpose of such gatherings. For a long time now, we have been discussing matters concerning people with disabilities ever since 1994. At that stage, disability was the flavor of the month for many, many years, up to and including the launch of the white paper on an integrated disability strategy in 1997. However, since then, it is my humble opinion that the disability has lost its focus. But I am heartened to realize now that the light, as it were, has once more swung towards matters concerning people with disabilities.
But are you happy? Perhaps that's the question that we should ask. Are you happy with what government is doing for people with disabilities?
I must, with respect, say I am not happy because we have fantastic legislation in place, starting right from the country's constitution,
yes,
through to the various pieces of legislation. But we people with disabilities are not feeling the effects as they ought to, simply because there has been poor planning, poor implementation, and poor monitoring.
Who's supposed to monitor this?
I believe it is a joint partnership. It is a partnership between government at all levels and also people with disabilities themselves.
Penny, I was saying here that don't you think it would really work in the favor of people with disabilities as well if summits of this nature are opened to civil society movements and organizations, so that, and FBOs as well, so that the message can then filter down to the people who may not be aware of what the needs and requirements of people with disabilities are. Because, I mean, you just heard Professor Magube there saying there's a lot of stereotype, and sometimes people are not necessarily doing this because they just want to take advantage of people with disabilities. It's something that perhaps may be subconscious in their minds, and these organizations are not taking part in the summits.
No, Paul, there were representatives of organizations at the summit. They had their chance to also speak to the president directly.
Okay.
There was also the first sitting of the Presidential Working Group, which is basically, if you look at 45 members that are sitting in that working group, the majority of them represent organizations of persons with disabilities and individuals who are able to contribute immensely to society.
Okay.
Government was merely facilitating the summit. The content and the preparatory aspects, even the participation, was entirely persons with disabilities, and we had our government colleagues whom we had to invite to be able to contribute towards the discussions, but also be part of the resolutions, as you have seen the declaration.
Yes. And then the white paper on rights of persons with disabilities, how would you describe it? Is it satisfactory?
Mpo, I think it is a satisfactory piece of policy. The reason being that it's a turnaround policy.
Yes.
It talks to aspects in respect of accountability mechanisms, legal recourse, enforcement, issues such as removing barriers to access to participation by persons with disabilities. It's one of the major strategic pillars of the white paper. Okay. The one is building an equitable state machinery, which means that the state has to take positive measures which strictly adhere to legislation, either for services, norms and standards, and so forth. It talks a pillar that looks at universal design, for instance. Okay. To say when you build a service point, any government building or any existing building must be built with disability specifications in mind, where you start it from scratch. And you just don't build it and finish and say, no, but we've left out something that is needed. Yeah. It must be from its inception that it's built properly and meets the standards of universal design.
Okay, hold it there. I want us to take a quick break. When we return, let's talk about discrimination, marginalization. He's touched a bit on accessibility as well, of people with disabilities. And I want you to tell me, Albert Peters, why you are still tolerating programs and projects that are said to be put aside for people with disabilities, and they do not have as much money as, the other mainstream, if one may say so. Whenever we talk of projects for people with disability, they tell you about suing. Let's talk about that only after the break. This question time, we'll be taking your calls, 089-1104-210.
SABC News. We report, contextualize and present news and current affairs honestly, fairly and fully. We consider it a duty to provide consistent, relevant, useful and top quality information and analysis. Our mission is to provide credible, accurate and interesting news programming, bringing news into everyone's homes in everyone's languages. Thank you, South Africa, for relying on SABC News for quality news output and for making us your #1 source of information. SABC News, Africa's news leader.
Welcome back. You're still watching Question Time. My guest today, Albert Peters, is a representative from the South African National Council for the Blind. And from our Pretoria studios, we have Benny Padime, who is a Director for Advocacy and Mainstreaming Disability Rights at the Department of Social Development. Now, Albert Peters, let's talk about this, the question of marginalization and discrimination. And like I said, I'm worried that policies are there, yet to implement them seems to be a challenge. People with disabilities seem to always receive the crumbs.
You are absolutely correct. I couldn't agree with you more. But the thing is, we must also be careful not to generalize. Because there are definitely some departments from at all levels, namely national, provincial, and local, who are trying to improve the lot of persons with disabilities, but not enough is being done.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if one takes the White Paper 6 on inclusive education that was finalized years ago. It was finalized, I think, in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, and it was supposed to be implemented in stages. I can speak for schools for blind learners who, sadly, have not felt the effects of what is promised or what was supposed to happen based on that white paper. There again, you spoke of implementation, and I cannot agree with you more. There are policies, there are programs, but there's no implementation and no monitoring at all. There are children in schools for the blind who do not have sufficient braille books or who have no braille books at all. Mm-hmm. The Perkins Braille writer is supposed to be the primary means of writing Braille in school. There are some instances when there is one machine that is shared amongst scores of learners. Now, how do you expect learners to perform as they ought to? You know, so that is just one example of a barrier that learners face. Okay. There are barriers in other instances as well. They've been talking about an integrated transport system for years as well. Yes. Which was supposed to satisfy the needs of persons with disabilities. All persons, be they wheelchair users, persons who are deaf, and persons who are visually impaired. That, unfortunately, has not materialized to its maximum. I could go on for hours talking about the barriers that we disabled people face. Yeah. And I think I need to add to Benny's earlier statement, and that apart from physical barriers, apart from the I won't say refusal, but the inability or not wanting to institute programs that will assist people with disabilities, there is one huge barrier, and that is the attitudinal barrier. Okay. The attitude of mainstream society towards people with disabilities of all ages. All right, let's talk to the man who is in charge of advocacy. Is he making enough noise? Benny.
I think I'm making enough noise like I'm doing now.
Yeah.
No, I must say this. Section 9 of the Constitution, subsection 2, prohibits the state from discriminating against any person with a disability. Section 28C of the Equality Act, Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, number 4 of 2000, talks to discrimination against persons with disabilities so that it's fully prohibited. There's also enough case law that I can quote that proves that discrimination against persons with disabilities is completely prohibited in this country. Let me address the quick question on education very quickly. There's the screening, identification, assessment, and support policy that has gone through the Department of Basic Education. It supports children with disabilities in every school. Now, in the last financial year, we've just received provincial reports today. There are braille notes that are being supplied to young people with disabilities in schools. Okay. Of course, there's still some discrepancy in the question of printing braille books, but braille production is being boosted in that case. I must say this. The president has announced that by 2021, no child with a disability must be out of school. So you can see there's a clear intention, and Cabinet has made that decision, and that's the direction the country is moving.
But Benny, what happens now? You see, you are privileged, and you are educated, and but there's many more children and other adults with disabilities who may not, have the background that you have, and obviously the courage. I mean, you are not a pushover, obviously, but there are those, who are still out there being treated like people with disabilities.
No, I agree, Mpo. That is why the question of attitude and mindset must move towards a paradigm shift of viewing disability from a social model perspective. To say disability is a developmental and human rights issue. It's not a health and welfare issue, but persons with disabilities still need social assistance and medical care, those that really need it. So the important thing here is how families join government in doing all of this, how society changes its approach towards persons with disabilities. That is why when you look at the policy defines disability from a social model point of view. It occurs when society discriminates against a person with a disability, you see, when they don't cater for their needs or cater for their care and don't mainstream disability into the plans, programs, and legislation of a country. And this policy now, this white paper, is a turnaround factor, a first of its kind that is actually addressing all of this. With regard to implementation, earlier on, you've raised a matter there. The policy, the white paper, has an implementation matrix that gives policy directives to all government departments with lead agencies and clear policy direction on those implementation plans. So it must be updated every year. Okay. It must be reported back to cabinet every year, and the review can take place every 4 years.
Albert, as we wrap up, there's a challenge also within the persons with disabilities communities. You are not united. You've so many fish and chips organizations that are not, speaking the same language. Talk to me about that, Mr. Peters.
Please call me Albert.
Okay.
There are times when I believe, oh, by the way, if I could please correct you with respect, I speak in my capacity as a person with a disability and not as a representative of the National Council for the Blind.
Okay.
I think I need to get that straight, okay?
All right.
Now, during the course of my many decades of involvement in the blindness sector as an advocate and as an activist, I have come across situations where organizations, local organizations serving the same sector, be it the persons who are deaf or persons with visual impairments. I have experienced instances where the management tends to protect territory.
Okay, I want you to hold it there. We must just take very quickly. Mbahari in the Northwest, you are, you've got very few seconds to just make your point.
Mpo, how are you?
I'm well, thanks for the call.
I'm all right. I just want to ask, when does the gentleman know, the one for social development?
Yes.
When it will be for our government to establish a full-blown ministry, like the way they did with women department? When will they establish that? Because of as long as the problem is treated as a sub-problem or as find in little bits and pieces of the departments, it is not well structured. So I just want to find when will a full-blown department, maybe a department of women, youth, and people with disabilities will be fully operational. Thanks.
Okay. Benny?
I'll be very quick, Mpo.
Yes.
That's a political decision. Currently, the situation stands, but the policy direction does not change.
Okay, gentlemen, let me welcome, or rather, thank you for the time, and hope that indeed the white paper will be put into practice and the rights of people with disabilities will be realized in our lifetime. That was Question Time for today. A big thank you to my guests and to you for watching the show. From me and the crew, you have yourself a wonderful time. Goodbye.